Can legacy guitar builders make new models? I was recently reading a lovely, lovely article from my friends at reverb.com, and I will link to that article down below, about asking the question, can legacy guitar builders come out with new models successfully, is the overall subject of the article. Now, I am making this Beard Files because it kind of touches on some things that I have touched on in past Beard Files episodes, namely, do we hate innovation, and asking, do we just not like new stuff at all? Or is it that we aren't just seeing any new designs that we like? But this time we're talking about guitars, and I thought this was an interesting subject. So I'm gonna bring up the article, and the guitar in question is the Gibson Modern Double Cut. Now that is Gibson's newest guitar, and it kind of reminded everybody of a poor man's Paul Reed Smith. And it's nothing, it's not like the Futura or the Modern or something like that. It's not some crazy wacky shape. It's generally a kind of a traditional shape, but it met with nothing but criticism, and just it was, the pitchforks came out, man. And that got the article's author, James Brill, wondering, can any legacy brands come out with any new models? Has their base group of players already long been established? Were they done making new models in the 60s? Now, I went back and retroactively kind of looked at the most popular models from Fender and Gibson, and we'll call them the big two, because when you think of electric guitars, it's Fender and Gibson. I mean, that's pretty universal. No one can really argue that. They are the two classic brands. And what I came up with was the newest model for Fender, which I know they've had new models, but the models that are still being made today, the newest model is the Mustang, which debuted in 1964, and Gibson came out with the Firebird in 1963. Now, Fender has come out with some hollow body ES335 style stuff, and they've come out with various other modern classics, or, you know, the 70s saw Fender and Gibson come out with a lot of wacky stuff, and we'll get to that in a minute, but the classics from both those companies all came out in the 50s and 60s. And then after that, things just kind of dry up. And I can't help but wonder, what was it like back then for guitarists not hating something that came out like new? Was it something that new that came out was like, oh wow, look at this rad Jaguar, which came out in 1962, or this awesome Jazzmaster, which debuted at NAMM in 1958. Things like that. And obviously the internet was not around. It's a shame the internet wasn't around, right? But every time Fender and Gibson came out with a new model, it wasn't really met with the extreme hate that things are met with today. Sure, things didn't sell. Witness the original run of Flying V's and Explorers from Gibson. Those were made in very, very limited numbers and are really, really rare today. And I think only a few hundred of those each were made. If something didn't sell, they simply just chopped it and moved on. And, you know, being the fickle beasts that us guitarists are, it's only years later we're like, oh, that cool guy's playing it, I want one. Even though I totally hated it before. I totally hated it 5 years ago. I talked so much trash about it. I hated it, but I want it now, because that's cool now, because Jimmy's playing it. I want a Flying V. I need a Flying V. Will some modern guitars from Gibson and Fender get the same treatment, historically speaking, as something like, let's say, a Gibson RD? This Gibson RD that I absolutely am in love with came out in 1977. Now, these did not sell well. It is unknown why they didn't sell well, but it's suspected that the atrocious sounding electronics with the Moog innards and the compressor and all that stuff contributed overall to the RD line not doing very well. Now, I will note that the standard does not have the super fancy pants electronics, but nevertheless, only 1,500, less than 1,500 of these original run Gibson RDs were made from 1977 to the end of 1981. That is a very limited number, but fast forward 40 some odd years later, and now they're being reissued, they're being copied. And just recently, Epiphone announced plans to release the Lima Leah signature Epiphone RD. So it's slowly coming back, and yet again, we're witnessing guitarists many, many decades later going, oh man, that's awesome. I want one of those. I hated it before, but oh, that's awesome. Now, is it because the instrument actually sucked, or just guitarists at that time weren't into it? We will never know unless someone has a time machine out there, and if you do, call me. But that begs the question, are these new modern guitars from these legacy companies, the Fenders and the Gibsons of the world and the Marshalls of the world, do they not do so well because the guitars are actually terrible? Or is it just because we are just stubborn? I think it might be a little bit of both. I think. But then again, if you go over to the amplifier side, Marshall released the JCM 800 in the early 80s, the 900 in the 90s, the JCM 2000 in the 2000s, and those were all wildly successful for Marshall. So is it different with amps than it is guitars? Or do we just want Les Pauls, SGs, and Strats, and Ibanez's, and Paul Reed Smiths? And that's it for electric guitars. That's all we want. Just the standards. But we want a highly different, modified versions of them. Which, as I will note, is most of Fender's entire line these days. Fender has 56 million different versions of the Strat, and the Telecaster, and the Jaguar, and the Jazzmaster, and the Mustang. You got the Road series, the Relic series, the list goes on and on and on, but there is the same 5 or 6 core models for Fender, and with Gibson, it's kind of the same story. It's just a different take on a Les Paul, and that's what they've always been good at, and maybe that's what they should stick to doing. What do you think? Do you think that these newer guitars, such as the modern double cut, are actually truly terrible, or do we just not want to see anything new from our classic beloved guitar brands? Let me know down in the comments. And as always, you've been wonderful. I've been Fluff. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.